This is the eLearn Podcast, episode 93.
Content is easy to scale. The thing that's really hard to scale is feedback. So if people are taking actions and doing something with it, how are they getting effective feedback and finding out if they're doing it right? And that's a much bigger problem when we try to take something that works in a 30-person class and scale it up to 3,000 or 30,000 people.
Welcome to the eLearn Podcast. My name's Ladek, and I'm your host from OpenLMS. My guest for today is Julie Dirksen. She's an instructional designer who's been an expert in the field for many, many years. And she's probably best known for her groundbreaking 2011 book that's titled Design for How People Learn, which is still one of those first books you should read if you're getting started in instructional design. The second edition was published in 2015. And she's also the founder and curator of usablelearning.com. Now, in this super practical and sometimes complex conversation, Julie and I talk about the distinction between instructional design and other forms of design, and why it's important to know the differences, especially when connecting desired learning outcomes to learning strategies. Julie and I also talk about how to decide what to train on, or said another way, what are people going to do with the information that you're about to give them? We also discuss how this differs in different contexts and with different skill levels amongst individuals. We also talk about why feedback is crucial to learning and yet is one of the things that we often neglect to give learners, and why feedback is also one of those things that's just really, really challenging to scale. We also talk about how one of the big blind spots in instructional design is how do you design good practice for learners, and how practice is neglected in so many areas of professional growth. Julie and I also talk about what we need to do when we've found all of the treasures in the game of adult learning, as a hat tip to a common problem with other gamers, and the difference between getting bored, topping out, and plateauing. Julie and I also discuss when and why you should use the Cynefin model to think through organizational problems, why using this model is important in picking the sex of baby chickens. So you're going to have to listen to the episode to figure that one out. And why it's really difficult to answer problems that involve deep complexity. Julie and I end our conversation discussing why it's worth it for everyone to lean into their superpowers so that you're always doing things that give you energy. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsors.
The eLearning Podcast is sponsored by the eLearn Success Series, a uniquely valuable set of events that bring together sector experts and thought leaders to offer solutions to the most critical challenges and issues at the intersection of education and technology. Get your free ticket to all 4 sessions at elearnsuccessseries.com. And OpenLMS, a company that provides world-class LMS solutions that empower organizations to meet education and workplace learning needs. Learn more by visiting openlms.net.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eLearning Hot Seat. My name is Ladek. I'm coming to you from OpenLMS. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. It's March 2nd already. I can't believe that. It's absolutely incredible. It's 2022, and we've already lost the first 2 months. But my guest for today is Julie Dirksen. Julie, how are you today?
I'm great.
That's wonderful. Where do we find you sitting?
I'm actually in Florida right now. Usually I'm in Minneapolis, but it's cold there, so I'm hiding at the moment. I'm actually in Sarasota, Florida. So,
ooh, that's really nice because, I was actually talking with my family up in Colorado. They just had this sort of cold front blast through them where it was like negative degrees up there, and I can't understand that. Spring has definitely sprung down here in Mexico. I'm glad to hear that you are nice and warm in Florida. That's beautiful. I always like to give my guests the opportunity to sort of just introduce themselves. So why don't you take 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and just tell us about who you are.
Sure. Yeah. I am an instructional designer from way back. My degree's in instructional systems technology. And I always say I wound up in instructional design because I'm happy as long as I get to learn something new. And it turns out it doesn't matter that much what it is. So, right now I'm learning about treating malaria in pregnant women and nutrition for new mothers and also whole term life insurance. So, it's kind of all over the place. I know, right? And what else? There's another one, but but it could be technology, it could be whatever. I wind up in a lot of different spaces, dealing with a lot of different topics. And I like to keep my hand in as an instructional designer, but I actually spend a lot of my time doing workshops for other people, because about, I wrote it in 2010. It came out in 2011. I wrote a book called Design for How People Learn. And it wound up being one of the sort of more well-known books for new people in instructional design. Basically, it really felt like we didn't have a first book that we'd hand people. So if you really wanted to learn about user experience design, people would give you Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think. Or if you wanted to learn about graphic design, people would give you the Non-Designer's Design book, or there's a few other options for that. But there didn't really feel like there was a good first book for instructional design. And so that was what I wound up attempting to write. And people have said that it works for that. That it's a pretty good accessible book for anybody who's just getting started, because so many people find themselves teaching things because they have a lot of domain knowledge. They know their subject really, really well. And because you're an expert on the subject, we want you to teach other people. But then they have this sort of panicked fake it till they make it on the teaching and learning side. And so what we were finding, what I was seeing was that a lot of people were kind of like, well, what does a classroom look like? You have a PowerPoint deck and you stand at the front and you go through slides and, or do it virtually or you do it whatever. And that they didn't necessarily understand some of the other things that, teachers and instructors and instructional designers need to do to make it a good experience for learners. And so the book was really intended to be kind of a foundation in how to think about it and how to think about what's the gap between where the learner is now and where they need to be, and how to just kind of understand the underlying principles of what they were trying to do well enough that they could hopefully make some better choices about it as they tried to apply that to their own content.
I love that. And I love that it's kind of stood the test of time as well. That's fantastic. I mean, what edition is it on at this stage?
It's the second edition came out in 2015, and the content's pretty evergreen. Like, it was really the foundations of things like educational psychology and so forth. So I've been talking to my publisher about whether we need a new edition, but I'm not sure that enough has changed to warrant it, but it's still, I actually think I may have sold the most copies ever this, Q1 of 2022,
Oh, really?
out of all of it. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
wow. That's amazing.
Like, the numbers the sales have kind of crept up over the years instead of going down. It winds up being that book that like somebody buys for their staff, or that people recommend to people who are just getting into it. And I think we're somewhere north of like 60,000 copies sold.
Oh my gosh. Congratulations. That is amazing.
It's in English, Russian, Polish, Italian, Korean, Chinese, and Arabic.
Because, of course,
there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason.
Not Spanish?
I would love Spanish. I would love Spanish. I would love Japanese.
I know my colleague Chris is listening right now. My team and the team at Open LMS listening right now. We're all like, we definitely got to get that in Spanish. So
that'd be great. I mean, the way, and you don't know any of these things until you kind of start dealing with publishers and stuff, but unless somebody in that language, group says, a publisher that, publishes Spanish language says we want it for, our set of publications, then they can buy the language rights, which are not that expensive, quite frankly. And then they can, do a translation and create their own edition. But unfortunately, it's more people come looking for it than it is,
Sure.
Especially a book that's been out as long as mine has. It's more about somebody showing up and saying, hey, we'd really like to translate it, which I strongly encourage. I think that'd be great.
Well, we will I think we need to put a note on that. We'll put a little sticky note up for that. I want to remind everybody that just in this particular moment here on March 2nd, we are live. And so if you're listening to us on Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube, we'd love to have your questions or your observations or your challenges or your successes, whatever. If you're in instructional design, if you're a teacher, if you're just somebody passionate about online learning, throw those questions in the comments. We do see them and we'd love to respond to them. One of the things, Julie, that you just said as you were kind of describing the why behind writing your book was, making a distinction between instructional design and X. Mm-hmm. I've had other people on the show talk about the difference between instructional design and graphic design, or instructional design and X. Can you just give us your take on that? Why is instructional design its own discipline?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, because the foundations of instructional design and sort of the whole, the ADDIE model, and analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate. The thing about ADDIE, and some people point this out, is like you can build anything with ADDIE. It could be a football stadium, or it could be like a restaurant menu. Like it doesn't there's nothing about that inherently kind of talks to design for learning necessarily. So a lot of what I found when I really started getting involved in it is that you would do this analysis, and then you would sort of like just move on to the design box, and then that was sort of magic happens here. And we didn't do a lot of connection between, if I figure this out in analysis, this is a learning strategy that really is effective for it. And I think that that's the heart of what I do. And there's lots more pieces to it. And there's the whole evaluation question and all of those kinds of things. But at its core, the thing that I'm always trying to work out is, if I ask these questions about the thing that's being learned and I get these kinds of answers, that means that this sort of strategy is an effective model for, or an effective learning strategy that we should use for something like this.
Okay, excellent. That kind of takes me into, what I wanted to talk with you about today. I mean, we've on the show and over the last year or 2 years, we've talked around the design topic quite a bit. One of the things that I don't think I've ever talked about is, how do you decide what to train? How do you identify what it is that, okay, these are the skills that we need? And I think it's really kind of a prescient topic, simply because we've all, and I don't want to say we've all, I don't want to give everybody put this yoke on everyone, but we're used to the new normal now. And now people are demanding new skills. People are saying, look, I'm going to take my skills to another company. If you don't give me this, or X or Y. So let me ask you that question. So what, if you're either that person who is the subject matter expert, or you are that learning and development, or learning in the L&D expert in a corporation, or maybe it's at a school as well. How do I go about determining, what are those skill gaps that are apparent, and then what do I do about it?
Yeah, well, and the simplest question is, because one of the issues that happens a lot is that there's this focus on information and content, right? So we need to communicate this content, or we need to help people understand this information. And the question that I'm always kind of pushing at that point, and I'm certainly not the only one who talks about this kind of thing, but is, if they have that information, what are they actually going to do with it? What's the action that they're going to take in the world? Because sometimes you don't get that in a way that's concrete or actionable, and so it really takes some digging to unearth it. So you might get things like, well, we want our call center staff to be customer focused, and I'll actually like pull the phone out and be like, all right, if I take a video of them being customer focused, what would I actually be filming? And trying to get people to kind of pinpoint what that what the actual behaviors are and things that they're going to do in the real world. Because quite frankly, one of the foundational things you learn as an instructional designer is how to write a learning objective. And there's a lot of format to it, and you learn about Bloom's taxonomy, and you learn about all of these kinds of things. And yet, I only have kind of 2 rules that I'll usually, do in workshops around learning objectives. One is, can it happen in the real world? And 2, can you tell if somebody, is it a visible behavior that you could tell if they could do it? And so, customer focused. Well, what are they at? If they are customer focused, what are the actual actions that they're taking? And this comes from the fact that I have a really, do most of my work in workplace learning, where, we don't do a lot of learning for the sake of learning, or learning for the sake of background, or,
Sure.
things like that. And obviously in higher ed environments, there's some different concerns that kind of come into play there. But ultimately, the thing that's satisfying for most people about learning is getting to do something with the knowledge that they have. And so using that as kind of a fundamental design guideline, I think, benefits almost everything. If you're learning about, science, if you're learning about chemistry, ultimately you're going to do something with that, or you're going to, you're going to take it as a class and then go do something else. But what are you going to do with chemistry, and how can we structure learning experiences around those things that you're actually going to do with it? And then what do people need, in addition to information? Because most, information is cheap, right? Information is cheap and it's replicable, and that's usually not our problem. I was having a conversation with somebody in an email listserv that I'm on where they were talking about scaling education. And I'm like, you know what? And they were talking about the content. And I'm like, content is easy to scale. The thing that's really hard to scale is feedback. So if people are taking actions and doing something with it, how are they getting effective feedback and finding out if they're doing it right? And that's a much bigger problem when we try to take something that works in a 30-person class and scale it up to 3,000 or 30,000 people. How are all of those people finding out if they're doing it right when they're taking action on it and things like that?
I want to ask you about how you scale feedback. But so if I'm the head of L&D, or I am, the training designer, or I'm tasked with, identifying these, let's just say we had our annual corporate review, and we said, look, we think that there are these parts of our business that we want to improve. What are my first kind of steps there, especially since I'm going to keep taking your customer service example there. There's going to be a breadth, a spectrum of people who are more customer service focused than those some people who are completely tone deaf to customer service. How do I disaggregate those people? And then am I creating something unique for each of them? Am I, putting them into sort of cohorts? Like what do I, like, where am I beginning with that sort of piece of the design process?
Sure. Yeah. So, some of it is like, if you're just dealing with people who are new to the organization and need to get skilled up on their customer services practice and procedures, that's one thing. It's another thing if you're trying to train existing staff and because usually we need more training comes from some kind of problem that's being solved. And so getting people to actually be explicit about that. Oh, we're seeing a lot of customer turnover. We're not retaining customers long-term, and we have to keep ramping up sales and getting new customers to replace the ones that we're losing. We think customer service could help that, but then you can investigate that question all its own, and go, okay, well, why do we have a lot of customer turnover? And maybe training will help it. It's entirely possible, but not kind of, one of the things I've just been doing in some of the workshops that I teach, which is like just recognizing the difference between a solution you're being handed to implement versus a problem you're trying to solve. So we need customer service training as a solution. They've already decided that the answer to the problem is training, and so they're just going to hand it to you and expect you to go off and do it, versus, oh, we have too much customer turnover and we're trying to reduce that by improving our customer service. And then you can get into questions like, why do you think the customer service is the problem? Is it not product quality, or is it not something else? Is customer service once they're actually on the phone with people the problem, or is it the problem that people get annoyed because they can't actually get anybody on the phone? There's all sorts of reasons why, you could be seeing this result. Are we actually sure that the training is a big part of it? And if it is training, then we want to look at the question of, okay, what is it that they need to be able to do? And, I'm actually working on some customer service stuff right now. And, part of it is, knowledge-based, like you need to know enough about the company and the products and stuff to be able to answer questions. But then, and a lot of times the computer system is the big stickler. I've just been dealing with my cable company a few weeks ago, and these people wanted to help me, and they actually seemed pretty well trained, but they kept being stuck because the system was not helpful. Let's put it that way. And so then we'll look at it and we'll say, okay, is it just knowledge? And a lot of the stuff gets treated like knowledge, but honestly, like I said, knowledge is cheap right now. Like the actual information or content is cheap. And so then you can look into the next question, which is it something like, is it just procedural stuff where they just need to know the steps for doing it? But we've already defined what we think correct performance is. So, if you're in a healthcare organization, they've got a procedure that they're saying, this is how we take blood pressure, or this is how we, bring in a new patient, or, input a new patient, or something like that. So there's a very procedural answer to it. But then there's the category I sort of think of as skills-based, which is the question that I always ask to distinguish if something's a skill is it reasonable to think that somebody can be proficient without practice? And if the answer is no, it's not reasonable to think they can be proficient without practice, then I put that into this kind of skills bucket. And there's different issues or questions and skills. But one of the big issues there is, obviously, if we've sort of said in order for somebody to be proficient, they have to practice, and often that practice needs to have feedback, then you already know a thing about how you're going to design your learning experience for them. It's going to have to include practice, and it's going to have to include feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't just tell them stuff and expect that they're going to go do it. I sometimes talk about, like, can you explain it to somebody over the phone? And if you can explain it to somebody over the phone, they can go do it. It's probably not a skill. But can you explain to somebody who's never hit a golf ball before, how to hit a golf ball over the phone and expect that that's going to go well? And the answer is probably not. But you get stuff like, one of the examples I'll use for that a lot is performance reviews. And I will ask people, is it reasonable to think that somebody can be proficient at performance reviews without practice? And people are like, no, they probably do need to practice. And I'm like, okay, did you get to practice when you were learning how to do performance reviews? And half the people will tell me, you learn how to do performance reviews? You just get handed the sheet and you do it.
Exactly.
And the other half are like, no, I had training, but it was just how to fill out the form and, some bullet points of good tips or something like that. And yet we know that feedback's really important to how well your employees succeed. And we know that, performance reviews, for good or ill, are one of the mechanisms for that. So wouldn't it be very important to your organization that managers are good at giving that kind of feedback, but it's not something where, like, they practice and they get some kind of feedback, or they get coached on it and they get better at it over time because they're getting, help with that. It's usually, here's the form, fill it out, use this block and this block and this block, and here's how you do it in the computer system or something like that.
I would love to see the meta studies on how performance reviews have equated to better employees over time. When we're thinking about gap analysis, and what skills are necessary, I heard you say in the beginning that, usually there's a problem that needs to be solved. Mm-hmm. How often do you see or do you hear that we want to grow in this direction, or we want to turn the ship this way, and we need our people to have this different set of skills? Like, is that a less common problem? And is there anything different about, building a new, building a new muscle rather than fixing a muscle? I'm not sure if I'm
answering that question. It's a good question. Well, and I mean, fixing the existing muscle has the issue of unlearning an existing set of behaviors. So if you're trying to kind of move the customer service organization in a different direction, the problem is, especially in something like a call center, they've probably gotten to the point where maybe 70 to 80% of what they're saying is automatic, and they're not even really thinking about it anymore. And that's a hard thing to undo. If you've ever done the thing where you go to a country where you have to drive on the other side of the road and to try to drive a car,
I've been there.
You know how hard it is to undo something that you've already learned in a way that's really automatic. And I don't think that's another issue where the only way that you're going to undo some of those automatic behaviors and sort of replace them with other behaviors is having kind of enough of that practice. I think practice design, like thinking through the actual issues around how to design good practice intervals and how much practice and things like that, is one of our big kind of blind spots in instructional design. I feel like there should be whole classes on how do you design good practice stuff. I've been talking to people in some of the more visible skills that I think have more of a sophisticated and kind of evolved practice format, and to try to understand kind of how they think through it. So I've talked to people who are like basketball coaches or teach musicians, because I think everybody's clear that, like, you're not good at basketball unless you practice on a regular basis. Musicians still play scales even if they've been in their career for 40 years or something like that. And so something about those, and then also medical, like things where you can kill people, we also seem to understand that practice is important.
Yes.
So doctors, driving, right? Pilots, anything like that, we understand the importance of practice, because if they don't do it right, somebody's going to die potentially. And so there's a more evolved methodology and structure around practice. I was talking to a couple of different people in healthcare education about how do you determine how many cases. So if you're learning to treat pancreatic cancer, for example, and that's, medical training that you're going through, how many case examples do you need to look at before you start to feel like this person can actually go then treat patients who have pancreatic cancer? And the answer is there doesn't seem to be like a formula or rubric, sadly, because I would really like to modify from somebody else's material around it. Actually, video game designers are really fascinating in this regard, because they actually have a very kind of strong sense of, if they're playing Call of Duty, how many times does this person need to practice, firing the weapon before they're going to be good at it enough to go on the raid? And then how many raids are they going to need to go on?
I've often seen that too. Like with a son as a gamer, there's always that. There's that period before you even can start the game. They give you that. It's training, right? I mean, they train you. Hey, here's the button you need to push, and here's how the devices work, and here's how you change stuff. Come to think of it, that's a really, getting you into the game is really important, because they need you to be successful. Otherwise you'll walk away from the game, right?
Right. And there's a balance in game design. They look at Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's flow state, where you want somebody to kind of always be on the edge of, you don't want their ability to far exceed the challenge in the game, but you want the challenge to maybe always just be a little bit above or below where their ability level is. And the way that they do it is they spin on a level. So like, you just got killed, you got to play that level again until your skill gets good enough that you can then go to the next level, and then the next level, and the next level.
Let me challenge you on that. Well, not challenge you, but I'm interested in your thoughts on it, because just riffing on this particular topic. So both of my sons are somewhat gamers. I wouldn't say that they're hardcore in any way, but my middle son, who happens to really, really love video games, he comes to me the other day and he's like, "Dad, I've got a problem." He's like, I think I'm finished the game. Like, I'm not like, he's like, I've found all of the treasures. I've done all of the things. He's like, it's like, what do I do next? Like, do we find that in other skill set building where, maybe you'll say you have a manager come to you and say, "Look, I think I got it all. Like, what do I do next?" Or I have an employee say, "Look, like, where can I possibly go next?" Like, is there an equivalent in adult development and adult lifelong learning? And like, and what do we do? I mean, in my analogy, my son's case, I'm like, look, we need to find something with more complexity, or we need to find the next level, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Does that same thing exist in adult learning?
Yeah, I think it does. I think there's sort of two aspects of that, right? Like, you get people in a role, in a job or something where they've topped out, and then people get bored. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, if your ability is far in excess of the challenge that you're dealing with, it's boring. So there's that, and we'll have that issue. And that's kind of a talent management issue of, what do you do with somebody when they're, and some people like kind of finding a comfortable rhythm and just doing it day in and day out, and they're okay with it. But then there's lots of people where, your smartest, most able person is now really kind of unhappy in this job. And, how do you manage that? There's another issue though, which is plateauing. So, oh boy, don't quote me on this one, but I think I've got it. I'd have to go track it down to find the source, but there's, the idea that like we continue to get better as we do things probably isn't the case in a lot of instances. So if you were a doctor in the first 5 years of your career, you've still got some upward trajectory, but at about roughly the 5-year mark, and that's the part, like I'm saying, don't quote me on this, you can level off at that point. And so a 10-year doctor or a 15-year doctor or a 20-year doctor didn't necessarily continue getting better unless they were actively pursuing additional education or really kind of working on their own development, stuff like that. So experience will improve your performance through those those early years as you're sort of coming up. But then once you hit a point, unless you take some action or do something, you may just stay at that level where you are for years and years afterwards. And so there's that whole phenomenon, because so much formal training that happens in workplace organizations is focused on new people. And there's a huge amount of capacity that could look at the question of, if I say, okay, where are my okay performers and where's my amazing performer? How big is the delta between those two? And they used to look at it in terms of like time and motion studies for things like an assembly line worker. Your best person might only be 50% better than your worst person. But if you look at like computer programmers, your best person might be 7,000% better than your worst person in terms of how error-free their code is, or how fast they write stuff, or, how efficient it is, or, things like that. And so as we get into these more complex jobs and things like that, we can look at that and kind of go, wait, there's an opportunity there. So if you have wait people in a bar and this person's okay, they're nothing special, but they're meeting requirements, they're doing the job, but, and they get okay tips and whatever. And then you've got this wait person over here who's amazing and everybody loves them, and they're taking home 3 times as many tips at the end of the night. And also, you can give them the hard section with all the tables in the huge party, and they're going to totally stay on top of it. And then ask, what's the difference between my okay person and my amazing person? And how are some of those personality, so like if this person's a little shy and this person's super outgoing, you're probably not going to train that, right? Like that's a personality thing. You want to hire for that. You don't want to try to convince people to be congenial. But you can help them kind of understand, like you're just okay person, like some things that might help, develop a customer rapport. There's probably some stuff you can do there. But honestly, if it's more a matter of how they organize their tickets, or how they, kind of track things, or, how many times they stop by the table, like those are behaviors that we could, kind of help, our okay person get better at. And then, wouldn't you rather have lots of great servers than several okay ones and a couple of, amazing ones?
Yeah, absolutely. So. And there's so many good questions to ask here. Well, and like the one that I don't even think you realize how many gems come out of your mouth at the same time, which is great. Like, it's, for instance, that you probably don't want to try to train for congeniality. You probably want to hire for that, right? Like and I think that's a real missed opportunity, or a real misconception for lots of, or maybe I've just been out of the workforce for too long and I don't know, but I think a lot of people miss that point, where there are some skills where you want to find your tribe. You want to find people who fit into your tribe, or you find people who, personify, what you want to have your brand mean, or your school mean, or whatever. And that's what you're hiring for, even if it's not you. That's another big one, is like hiring for the people who aren't you. That's so. But the question I want to ask is, you took us right there so beautifully. The programmer that is 7,000 times better than the minor one, or the waiter that's 5 times better than your mediocre one. A lot of times there's a piece of complexity there. Yeah. Or there's a skill set that you can't, okay, like, and we're talking about things like leadership, and again, going back to sort of like a really truly great person who just gets customer service, or creativity. These are all things that we know can be, you can learn.
Right.
So, but
sort of, yeah.
But okay, then take me there. So, but what I've heard many times, again on the podcast here or in other places, is, okay, look, especially online learning, it's great for, okay, look, how do I use Excel, or how do I take my staff step by step through the compliance training, or this or that. But there's this whole universe of more complex skills and more complex things. Like, so where do you start with that? What's your advice on that? And in sort of basically designing and teaching complexity?
Yeah. So one of the models that I use to think through skill stuff is the Cynefin model. And I think I'm pronouncing it right. It's CYNEFIN. It's a Welsh word. It's from Dave Snowden. And he used it to talk about organizational problems. And he said that there are certain problems that are, I think he's calling them clear now, but they're simple, they're obvious. And that's what I would call procedural. We know what the rules are. We know how to do it. We've defined correct performance, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like just a few steps. It might be all of the standard operating procedures for a nuclear power plant, where we've defined all of this stuff to the nth degree, because again, you can kill people. the checklist for operating a 747 or whatever it is. But we've sort of said we know what correct performance looks like. We know what that is. Then he talks about problems that are complicated, and that's where expertise really comes into play. And that's where, if you've seen enough examples, you start to know what, you start to do that pattern recognition. I was working with an NGO, and they were trying to teach people how to do root cause analysis in healthcare organizations. And so they said, well, you've got this method of analysis, and you've got this method of analysis, and this, and you try to go through all these until you get down to root cause analysis. And I'm like, so I said, okay, well, how do you know when to stop? How do you know when you've dug deep enough and you found, root cause? I had 13 experts in the room, and they all just gave me a blank look and said, well, you just kind of know. I'm like, great.
That's great.
That's not hard to explain to new people at all. But you do. You kind of go, okay, I think we're getting there. And so that's something where, if we're training for that kind of expertise, the question is, how does somebody see enough case examples that they start to recognize the patterns? There's this crazy thing where when baby chickens are born, it's important to know if they're male or female, because egg production industry has a lot of use for females, and we won't discuss what happens to all those extra males. But apparently when you have a baby chicken, it's hard to tell if it's male or female. It's not obvious. And so for a long time, and I'm not even sure what methods they're using right now, but for a long time, the best chick sexers, which was a job, were trained in Japan. And what they would do is they'd have an expert go through and say male, male, female, female, male, male. And then they'd have the new person come through and guess and find out if they're right, and then guess and find out if they're right. By the time they had done this some tens of thousands of times, it took that many, they were really good at it, but they still couldn't tell you exactly what they were looking at. They just got very good at it. But it was still some subtle thing about the chicken that and if they saw enough, they'd start to recognize it. But
is this that Malcolm Gladwell blink principle?
It is kind of like
it's your brain can like recognize that complexity and.
Right. And the issue with that, which actually the Gladwell stuff is interesting, because he talks about the 10,000 hour thing, which came from Anders Ericsson's research. And Anders Ericsson, one of the things he did was look at training radiologists to read x-rays to identify cancer, for example. And what they would do is, you'd get exposed to a certain number of cases through your medical education. But the question was that good enough? Was that enough? Were you really starting to recognize it? And so one of the things that Anders Ericsson worked on was a database of 16,000 x-rays where they knew the outcomes. And so instead of looking at 12 x-rays over the course of the week, because these are patients that came in, you could look at 180 by sitting down and kind of drilling through the thing. And this is also where some of the AI stuff is coming in now. It looks at enough case examples and starts to be able to identify patterns and things like that. But this is where a lot of expertise comes in. So if somebody comes in and says, I have a learning problem, help me with that, I kind of have a little checklist in my head of questions I'll ask, and then I'll discard this set of answers. And we all do this, right? And things we're knowledgeable about. But being able to kind of take that out of your head and make it explicit for somebody else is really hard. And they don't typically spend the kind of money and effort that you need to do it for something other than, say, airline pilots, where they have done that. They've figured out all the stuff that used to just be in pilots' heads 60, 70 years ago, and figured out how do we put it into a procedural thing that we can actually teach to other people. So that's a big question for me, is exposure to case examples. The problem and the issue where the Blink stuff came in is that there's also what Dave Stone refers to as complex. And the issue with complex is that there isn't necessarily a right answer.
No.
So, and that goes to changing conditions and things like that. So if I go to a pricing expert and I say, how much should I charge for my product? They can't give you an answer. What they do is they say, here's how you do audience analysis. Here's how you do competitor analysis. Here's how you test prices, pricing schema to see whether or not people will pay that. They have a bunch of methods of inquiry, basically, to try to gather data up from the world. But honestly, the price you're charging for your software package could change tomorrow because Google just came out with a free version that does 97% of the same exact thing. And so the answer today is not necessarily the answer tomorrow. Amazon pricing clearly has embraced that. The price of an object today and tomorrow could be completely different. Who the hell knows what that algorithm is. But so that's a case where expertise certainly helps in terms of knowing what questions to ask and how to do inquiry into the world, but there isn't a right answer for somebody to know and just tell you through that expertise. There's ways of investigating the question. So there's simple, clear, there's complicated, where there probably is a right answer, an expert might be able to tell you. There's complex, where an expert can't tell you, but they can help you figure out how to research and, do this sort of inquiry into the world and bring back data and analyze it. And then he talks about chaotic, which is the first month of a global pandemic, or after a cyber attack, or on the ground after the earthquake hits, where you don't really have an answer either, but you're just trying to kind of get things back under control enough that
a lot of noise and no signal. Yeah.
And pull it back into other domains by trying to organize things and stuff like that. And each of those needs different learning kinds of things. The procedural stuff we're already pretty good at. That's fine. Complicated, which is the expertise thing, then the question is how are people getting exposed to enough case examples that they start to see the patterns themselves? Complex is about learning methods. So when we talk about something like creativity, I don't know if you can make somebody more creative, but I know you can teach them methods for investigating creativity. So ways and practices and things for investigating that problem and bringing back data and thinking about solutions and stuff like that. So I think I'd put that in that complex domain of there isn't a right answer, but there's ways of investigating the question. And then a lot of the training that we look at for chaotic is things like, if you're training first responders, how do you give them enough practice in simulated environments that they don't completely lose their minds the minute you put them into an actual emergency situation, and how do you triage and do some of those kinds of things. So in each of those domains, you have different things you need and different learning experiences you need to give people to help support them.
Fantastic. That was just such an incredible breakdown of that. Have we lost, I guess, the one part I didn't hear in there that my brain is sticking out right now is we used to rely so much upon the mentor apprenticeship model. Does that fit in here in a way, like where rather than rather than trying to like break it down and say, hey, how do I like organize this? I feel like the apprenticeship, and maybe it's already within one of these buckets, because it's observing, it's then trying and failing. It's then saying, hey, do it my way. It's being taught a specific way, whereas there may be other ways that are great, but this is the way this expert does it. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah,
well, I mean, I think the ways that you can measure things are really different in each of these. So if you're in that simple kind of clear, obvious box where we've defined clear performance, then somebody can take a checklist and say, yes, you can do all these things, or we can have a multiple choice test to verify that you know the procedural steps for something or whatever. I think the problem occurs when we try to use those multiple choice tests for things that are in complicated or complex. And I do think that in complicated and in complex, that mentor, that expert evaluator, that person who can provide feedback and guidance is enormously important, because that's how do you find out if you're doing this well and getting better at it is if there's a measurable result. So if you're getting better at shooting baskets, because you're getting more baskets in. But if you're not getting better at shooting more baskets and you're not sure why, you're not going to get better just by continuing to try to do it. You're going to need somebody who can stand next to you and say, here's the problem I'm seeing, and here's what I think you need to work on. So, yeah, I think in particularly in probably complicated, that's where that expertise thing is really helpful. I think in complex, people can take a lot of these methods. Design thinking is an interesting one, right? Because design thinking done really well can be an amazingly powerful tool. And design thinking done poorly can be a way for people to like codify their biases with Post-it notes.
Sure.
And so there's good and bad versions of it. And so that's where somebody like that expert, that expert coach or feedback or mentor or something like that, I think is enormously important.
I've been this whole time. I just have to put it on the table because I got to get it out of my mouth. Is that I've just been thinking about. I'm a guitar player. As many people have listened before, and one of the things that you learn. So my son again will come to me. He's like, Dad, how is it that you know how to play some of these rock and roll songs? Or whatever. I'm like, well, I've been playing the guitar for 30 years, and so you could think about all of these complex different ways you could do chords, but it's probably most likely that the person who wrote this was, a rock and roll star, and they usually choose the easiest way to do something, right? And so those are the chords that you use. They choose the easiest ones, right? And how do you make the easiest one? It's very rare that you have somebody, doing this really super complex stuff. So anyway, and I'm trying to explain that to my son at a time, but the only way that he's going to be able to get that is by doing it and seeing it thousands of times, right? Like that's the only way I can explain. It's like, you just kind of know. So
yeah. So yeah, absolutely. And I think that music is full of that. I was reading an article just the other day that was talking about somebody was trying to understand why all these people say that the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds is the best rock and roll album of all time. There are people who've said that. I mean, they put it at the top of their list.
100%. Oh, I've seen it. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I like Pet Sounds just fine, but I'm not. I like it. I really do. Sure. I am not. My knowledge of music is clearly not sophisticated enough to understand what other people are hearing in this that they're saying makes it, so much more magical than, like if I had to pick, I'd probably pick most Beatles albums over it, and that's good. Like those are both, right up in there. So that's fine. But I mean, I like it. It's great, but I'm missing something about the subtlety of why people are like, oh, that.
But I wonder, but here's the thing. I wonder about that. You're missing, but there's another. So Toto's Africa. We're going to turn this into a music podcast suddenly. Okay. But so why is it Toto's Africa? So it's because when they sing the chorus, the harmonies build downwards rather than building upwards the way that they usually. So usually that's the way we're always taught, right? La la la. Right? La. But they actually go down, and so that's one of those unique things, right?
And that's amazing. And I totally could not. I've heard that song how many hundreds of times, and I could not have told you that. But I was trying to think. Like, there's some interesting stuff around. There was a study where they were looking at musicians and non-musicians, and they were playing certain music in the wrong key. So in the right key and the wrong key, and then a musician's like, oh, you got to stop. That's not okay. And I was just like, oh, really? I guess the other one sounds a little better. I don't know. And I'm good at a lot of things, but none of them are musical. So I'm kind of fascinated by it because there is this whole level of stuff around music that I don't have any access to. And I was trying to figure out like what's something in that I do feel like I have expertise in that makes me crazy that somebody who isn't maybe an expert in that space wouldn't notice. And I was thinking like, when people are writing and they do non-parallel bullet points, so like one bullet point's a sentence and then two or more phrases and then something else, I'm just like, whoa, you gotta fix that. But I think there's probably people who aren't tuned into things like instructional writing and stuff who would be like, that's fine, it makes sense. I kind of understood what they're saying. And so I think that's one of the things I love about looking at the whole expertise thing is what are those subtleties? What are those things that somebody, starts to really kind of understand and sense patterns about that somebody who's a novice really, whoosh, music has lots of them. I love music. I love listening to music. I played, the violin as a kid, but it's really, really, really not an area that I like. There's a whole bunch of stuff I'm just like, whoosh, no idea.
That's when you just sit back, and you have your bubble bath and you put on and you just say, you know what, I'm just going to enjoy this.
Yeah.
There are lots of things in life. We just enjoy it.
Right.
One question I want to ask you before we run out of time is, and I don't know if this is in your domain or not, but
sure.
Where and at what point, let's, as I'm trying to either teach complexity or build that new muscle or whatever, is there a point when I'm either designing the learning or I'm watching it play out in that Addy method where I say either this isn't right or the cohort that's coming through, I'm like, look, this just isn't working. You're not right for this. Like, I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, how do I identify the people who again, that star, the star waiter, and you're like, oh man, maybe they would be a great manager. But no. Yeah. Right. Like, you know what I mean? Like, cause you can have that star forward basketball player, but they may not be a great coach.
Right.
Like, have you seen, like, how do we identify that challenge or how do we identify and
there really does go to things like hiring and so forth. And I will admit that that's that's pretty well out of my area of expertise. I kind of want to believe we can get everybody there.
Yeah, we can get anybody
figure
there.
out how to craft the learning experience well enough. But some of it kind of goes to what's the appropriate level of investment for this. And then also, I am a really big believer in people leaning into their superpowers. Figuring out, Tim Ferriss asks a question, which is, what do you find easy that other people find hard? And if it's something where you're like, oh yeah, that's easy. And I usually ask it in a different way. I'm usually like, what do you work on that gives you energy? And what do you work on that takes energy, that drains you of energy? And figure out how to do more of the things that give you energy. And so I'm a big believer, and is that the organizational's responsibility or the individual's responsibility? Probably some of both. But I'm a big believer that if you're doing the right kind of work and you're leaning into those superpowers and you're doing things that give you energy, that's going to develop well. And that's going to be a virtuous loop where, it's self-reinforcing. And if you're trying to force yourself to do things that are energy drains and that, yeah, you can do. I did project management for years. Turns out I hate project management. I really don't want to do it. I have to do it for my own stuff, but I don't want to project manage anybody else.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it's a good use of my time. Like, I could do it, but boy, I know people who are sort of natural project managers, and that's a way better thing, is to hire one of those people than for me to try to force the issue of doing it. And so figuring that out, and that is a challenge, because that's something that you can't just kind of match up a resume to a job description and feel confident that you've got that. But I think asking people, finding out what parts of the work that they're doing that, like I said, that gives them energy. And, like, you do stuff where you're exhausted at the end of it, but it's good tired, right? Like, it's the kind of like, oh yeah, okay.
Oh, it's that satisfied feeling, right? Like, there's nothing like coming out of something that you do well, like a skill that you absolutely love, and having that just depleted, I gave it my all. Whatever the outcome was, you're like, yes, that was fantastic. Nothing quite like it.
And so, I think it's a joint effort. I mean, I've been self-employed for, I don't know, a dozen years now. And so I haven't interviewed for a job in a really long time.
Congratulations.
But I had job interviews where I convinced the person not to hire me, because it was one of these things where I'm like, you know what, the way you're talking about this, and, it was friendly, like we were getting along, but we both sort of agreed, like, oh no, this isn't right. This isn't the right fit, and that's ideally kind of how that should always work, is we're finding somebody whose nature and the kinds of things that they like doing day in and day out. But, that's hard, because especially when you're getting started in a career, you don't know what day-to-day life looks like. I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was saying how she really thought she was going to be like an advertising copywriter. And then she was like, wait, I don't want to sit at a desk all day writing about soap. No, that's not, no. So, she went on and did all sorts of other interesting things, but she did not become an advertising copywriter, because she didn't, she sort of like, she didn't realize, until it kind of got close to that point, what you were going to be doing all day long, and how do you find things that suit you well. So I don't think that answers anything on an organizational level, but yeah, I think that is the challenge.
Fantastic. Last question I have for you, and is one that I ask everybody here on the hot seat, which is, what are you excited about? Near-term excitement. So, 6 to 12 months out, like, is there anything that you're especially looking forward to in 2022 in terms of a new design technique, a new opportunity, people coming out of the pandemic, a shiny new object, anything that you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, well, so the next book that I'm going to work on is on behavior change. And so it's pulling things in from the behavioral sciences. So one of the big things I look at is, I started talking about gaps, and I was talking about knowledge and procedure and skills, but then I also look at habits. And I think there's a lot of really great research coming up in the habit space, and I think that's super important. I look at motivation. So if they know what to do, but they still aren't doing it, what do we do then? And so that's probably the next thing I've been doing workshops on it, and I've been immersing myself in it for several years, because I worked probably like 15 years ago on it. It was an AIDS and HIV prevention curriculum. And I'm like, I don't think the answer is we just need to tell people again that condom usage is important. Like, I don't think that's the issue. I don't think they missed that message somewhere, all the way through the 90s. I think they heard it, So what else is going on here? What are the other reasons why a behavior might be happening or not happening, and getting into that? So that's super exciting, because that's an area that's really coming up. You're starting to see companies with chief behavioral officers, and you're starting to kind of have, I think, an awareness of all of the stuff that's coming in from the behavioral sciences. Honestly, this pandemic has been the world's largest behavior change experiment that in basically the history of in human history. How do you get a whole bunch of people to change their behaviors real fast? And on one hand, I think we hear that we failed in a lot of ways around that, but on the other hand, the number of people who wore masks, got vaccinated, and did all the things and stayed 6 feet away, like, that's extraordinary. There's many other behavior change kind of initiatives that would love to have the kind of success rate and buy-in.
And you only just touched on like the public health ones. I mean, the norms that have been changed in the workplace, the norms that have been changed in the education space, the norms that have been changed in families and how we communicate. Like, I mean, we're going to be writing about this for decades, right?
Yeah.
I hope that there's just a ton of research going on right now about all of these behavior changes and how they happen, for sure.
Yeah. So that's the next big thing. And it's a mixed bag, because there's good versions of it and there's not so good versions of it. There are, technologies that have changed our behaviors, and not always for the better. So, trying to understand that, and the ethical reckoning around technology and all of that kind of stuff, I think it's not exactly something I'm excited about as a shiny object, but I do think it's an important conversation that we need to be having. So.
Hear, hear. Julie Dirksen, you are the author of Design for How People Learn, which is still an important book, but you're going to be writing a new one on behavior change, which is, I'm sure, is going to be equally awesome. And also, we can find you at usablelearning.com for everyone who wants to reach out and check out your stuff.
All right, great.
Thank you so much for being on the show today. I really, really appreciate it. Absolutely fantastic stuff.
This has been a very fun conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the eLearning Podcast. If you like what you heard, please do me the favor of following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or whichever social media you prefer. Also, if you're interested in diving deeper on e-learning, I encourage you to get your free ticket to the eLearning Success Summit, where there are more than 70 hours of presentations on best practices. Just go to eLearningSuccessSummit.com. And then finally, for the latest news, information, and resources about e-learning, come subscribe to our newsletter at lmspulse.com. Thanks.